She opened her heart to him. Now he won't leave unstable. The room was suffocating. The air felt thick, heavy, as though it had been trapped in this small space for far too long. She could hear his breathing. Soft, but so close. It was unsettling. The door had been left slightly ajar, and yet he never left. Not for days. Not even for a moment. His presence loomed over her like a dark cloud. Her mind was a mess, torn between wanting him to stay and desperately needing him to go. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls closing in. Every time she turned around, there he was. Watching. Waiting. He never spoke much. He didn't have to. His eyes said everything. She could feel them on her constantly, like a weight pressing against her skin. A chill ran down her spine every time she thought of it. Her fingers trembled when she reached for the glass on the table. She couldn't shake the thought that he was never really going to leave. Not now. Not ever. The sound of footsteps echoed through the silent apartment. She froze. It was him. His silhouette darkened the hallway. He had been standing there, just out of sight, for God knows how long. Her heart pounded. She wanted to scream, but the words stuck in her throat. It had all been so simple at first. He had been kind, charming even. But now his kindness felt like a trap. A cage she couldn't escape from. Her pulse quickened. Every time she tried to confront him, he would just smile that empty smile. And the smile, it haunted her. It felt like a promise that she could never break. Her fingers pressed to her lips, trying to calm the shaking, the panic rising in her chest. She thought about the way he'd looked at her the first time, how he had begged to be let in. Now, she couldn't get him to leave. There was no space for her anymore. Only him. Her fingers brushed the door handle, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. What if he was standing on the other side? What if he followed her? There was no escape. Only darkness. Her breath came faster, sharper. The walls felt like they were closing in even more. She couldn't breathe. And yet, she couldn't run. Because she had let him in. And now he was never going to leave. Not now. Not ever. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat a violent reminder of how trapped she was. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Her body trembled as if the very air around her was tightening, squeezing the life out of her. She turned slowly, her eyes catching his, watching her from across the room. The same empty smile played on his lips, his gaze never wavering. It was as if he was always watching, always waiting. The silence stretched on, suffocating, unbearable. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words were lost. She couldn't form a sound. Her throat was dry, tight, like it had been closed off by something unseen. She moved toward the window, her hand brushing against the cold glass. Outside, the world seemed so far away. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that reached toward her like fingers. Was anyone out there? Could anyone hear her? Her mind screamed for help, but her body refused to respond. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who no longer recognized herself. Her eyes were wide, hollow. Her hair, a mess of tangled strands. Her face pale, drawn, as though life had drained out of her. She pressed her hands to the glass, the cold seeping into her skin, grounding her in the reality of her situation. He stepped closer. She could feel his presence behind her. Too close. So close, she could almost hear his breath. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. He didn't answer. He never did. His silence was deafening, but it was also everything. His presence was the answer. She had let him in. And now, there was no leaving. Her heart pounded louder, drowning out the sound of her own breath. Was she going crazy? Or was this her reality? His fingers brushed her shoulder, so light, but so cold. Chill ran down her spine. "Please, I just want to be alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But his hand lingered, hovering. She turned her head, meeting his gaze once more. His eyes, cold, empty, stared back at her. A shiver coursed through her. There was no escape from this. No way out. Her mind screamed, but her body was frozen. In that moment she understood. She had given him everything. And now there was nothing left. Not for her. Not for anyone. She had opened the door. And he had walked in. And now he would never leave.
Not now.
Not ever. She felt it in her bones. The walls were closing in. And he was the one who held the key. The silence between them was unbearable now. Her skin prickled with an unnatural coldness, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. His presence felt like a weight, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She tried to step back, but her feet wouldn't move. Her body was rooted to the spot, held captive by something she couldn't explain. He was too close now. Too close. She could hear his breath, shallow, almost like it was waiting for her to make a move. She needed to leave. She had to leave. But something stopped her. A part of her, deep inside, wanted him to stay. The part that had let him in. The part that had welcomed him, without hesitation. But now, that part was silent.
Fading.
She didn't know when the shift had happened, but it had. She was no longer the person who had opened that door so willingly. Her heart raced. Her hands were clammy, shaking. Why couldn't she move? Why couldn't she speak? Her gaze flickered to the door. The door she had always used to escape, to find safety. But it wasn't an escape anymore. Not with him in the room. He was everywhere. His eyes never left her. They felt like they were burrowing into her soul, seeing everything, knowing everything. "Please," she whispered again, her voice barely a breath. "Please leave." But his smile only deepened. It was a twisted thing now, like he was enjoying the torment. His eyes gleamed in the low light, full of something dark. Something unsettling. "You're not alone," he said softly, his voice smooth like silk. His words wrapped around her, tightening, suffocating her. "I'm always here," he continued, stepping closer. His presence was overwhelming. There was no escape. No running. He was everywhere she turned. In her mind. In her heart. He was a shadow that followed her every step, always just behind her, never leaving. Her hand hovered over her chest, her breath caught in her throat. His hand reached for her, not gently, but with purpose. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the words wouldn't come. She was frozen. Frozen in place. "Why did you let me in?" he asked, his voice low, almost accusing. The question cut through her like a knife. She had let him in. She had opened the door. She had invited him to stay. Now he was never going to leave. Not now. Not ever. And she couldn't stop him. Because it wasn't just the door he had walked through. It was her. It had always been her. Her pulse raced, each thud echoing in her ears, like a drumbeat that wouldn't stop. She felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her. Why had she let him in? Why had she opened that door? Her mind screamed at her, trying to force a memory, a moment of clarity, but it was lost.
Gone.
Her fingers twitched, but still, she couldn't move. She couldn't think. She could only feel him. Asterisk his presence asterisk. In every corner of the room, in every breath she took. He had become the air. The walls. The space between her thoughts. He was everywhere. His hand brushed the side of her face, so soft, yet so cold, like a whisper against her skin. She flinched, but couldn't pull away. Her body refused to move. His eyes never left hers.
Cold. Dead.
Empty. "Do you remember?" he asked, his voice a murmur now, so low it felt like it was inside her head. She didn't answer. How could she? Her mind was a blur, a mess of fragments. Was he the same man who had begged her to let him in? The man who had seemed so lost, so broken? The man who had made her feel important, needed? Or was this, the shadow standing before her, the true version of him? She could barely breathe under the weight of it all. His fingers traced the curve of her jaw, his touch lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "You asked for this," he said softly. "Did I?" she whispered, her voice cracking. She hadn't asked for this. Not this. But the words felt hollow, as if they had already lost their meaning. "Yes, you did," he replied, his lips curving into that same twisted smile. The room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching longer, pressing closer, as if they were becoming part of him. Her heart pounded harder now, like a frantic rhythm, urging her to do something. Anything. But she couldn't. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. Her gaze flickered to the door again. It was still ajar, but the world on the other side no longer seemed real. Her hand reached out, just inches from the door handle, but it was useless. Her fingers brushed the metal, cold as ice. It felt like she was touching something that didn't belong to her anymore. Something that was beyond her reach. The door was an illusion. The world was an illusion.
She had let him in.
And now there was no way out. The realization hit her like a wave. He had taken everything. Everything. And there would be no return. No escape.
Not now.
Not ever. Because he was inside her. And she was inside him. There was no boundary anymore. No lines between them. No space. She was lost. In him. And he was never going to leave.
Not now.
Not ever. And she couldn't remember if she ever wanted him to. The air around her thickened, heavier than before, like the very space was pressing in on her, shrinking with every passing second. She should have been afraid. But something inside her had changed. A quiet surrender, a resignation to the presence that had overtaken her life. She had wanted him to stay, hadn't she? At some point, she had welcomed him, embraced him, thinking she could control it. But now she was just empty. His fingers remained on her face, cold and unmoving, but somehow they felt like chains. Chains that had wrapped themselves around her heart, around her mind. A soft, almost imperceptible laugh escaped him. It wasn't kind. It wasn't reassuring. It was dark, twisted. Like he had known all along that this would be the end of her. "You wanted me here," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear, his words lingering in the space between them, thick and suffocating. "I did," she said, almost mechanically, the words falling from her lips without thought. It was the truth. But it didn't feel like the truth anymore. It was a lie. A lie she had told herself to make sense of the darkness she had invited in. The room seemed to pulse with his presence, each breath she took drawing her further into him, deeper into the dark. Her hands, once trembling, now hung limply by her sides. There was no fight left in her. The door, once a symbol of freedom, of possibility, was now just another part of the illusion. She had tried to open it earlier, hadn't she? But it had felt wrong, as if her own body was preventing her from leaving. Her gaze drifted to the window, the faint glow of the streetlights outside barely breaking through the darkness of the room. The world felt miles away. A world she couldn't reach. A world she could never return to. His grip tightened on her, but it was gentle, almost affectionate. A possessive tenderness. His eyes met hers, those cold, hollow eyes that used to make her shiver. Now they didn't scare her. They belonged to her. And she, in turn, belonged to him. She had let him in. And now, she was part of him. She could feel him inside her, his presence in her every thought, every breath. His darkness had seeped into her skin, into her soul, until there was nothing left of the woman she had been. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly, almost tenderly. She could barely hear him over the pounding in her chest, but the question was more than just words. It was a plea for her to admit it. To admit that there was no way back. To admit that she had wanted him here, and that the door was never meant to close. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. His smile deepened. A smile that wasn't cruel, but knowing. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "Good," he murmured. Because now, there was no escaping. Not now. Not ever. They were the same now. Bound. And there was no world left for her outside of him. She had let him in. And he had never left. Not now. Not ever. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, between them. Her thoughts were a blur now, the boundaries of her mind blending with his, tangled in a web she couldn't untangle. She was trapped, but she no longer knew where the trap began and where it ended. Had he trapped her? Or had she done it to herself? The room around them seemed to dissolve, the edges blurring, as if it was no longer real. The space between them, between her and everything she once knew, was vanishing. She felt a soft pull in her chest, like a tether, drawing her closer to him. And for the first time, she didn't want one. He was all there was. All she needed. Her eyes fluttered open, catching his gaze. There was no longer a trace of the fear she had once known. No hesitation. No regret. Only peace. He smiled again, his expression unreadable, as though he were watching her closely, waiting for something. But she didn't need to say anything. He knew. "I could have left," she said, her voice soft, barely a whisper, as if the air itself might swallow her words.
"But you didn't," he replied.
His voice was calm, knowing, the echo of her own thoughts. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." She had wanted to leave. She had tried to leave. But in the end, she realized that leaving wasn't possible. Not anymore. There was no need to ask why. The question no longer mattered. The past, the life she had once lived, felt like a distant echo, a dream, slipping away into the vastness of the dark. All that remained was this room, this moment, her and him, the dark, endless connection they shared. And yet, something in her heart whispered that even this oneness, was only the beginning. There would be no return, no separation. He would never leave.
Not now.
Not ever. And as her eyes closed again, not in fear but in acceptance, she felt herself dissolve into him completely. No longer a woman. No longer a soul trying to escape. Just part of him. And he, part of her.
Together.
Forever. Nothing else mattered.
Not now.
Not ever. Only this. The room felt like it was closing in on her, though it had been still for what felt like an eternity. The walls seemed to bend, the air thick with the weight of the moments that had passed, moments that were slipping away, evaporating into the abyss that was now her life. She could still hear his voice in the silence, low, almost a hum. It was like an echo within her mind. He hadn't moved in what felt like hours. Neither had she. There was no need to. It was as if the two of them were frozen in this moment, a still image caught between time and space. She stared at the floor, the faded carpet beneath her feet suddenly feeling foreign, like something she no longer had a connection to. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight. She didn't know why. She hadn't felt fear for a long time. But now, something stirred inside her. Something that wasn't him. It was a strange, cold emptiness. A feeling she had buried beneath layers of him, of them. But it was there now, rising up like an old memory she had tried so hard to forget. What if? What if this wasn't peace? What if this wasn't the final answer? Her fingers clenched at her sides, but she didn't move. She wasn't sure why she wanted to. Why now? Hadn't she made peace with this? Hadn't she accepted that he was part of her now? That they were one, locked in this eternal darkness together? But the emptiness inside her, the one that she had ignored, convinced herself she didn't need to acknowledge, began to gnaw at her. A small whisper in the back of her mind, faint but insistent. Is this enough? Her hand twitched. The room was too quiet, too heavy. She could feel his presence behind her, like a shadow that never let go, a weight pressing down on her chest. He was waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to do something. But what could she do? She had let him in. She had chosen this. Hadn't she? Her fingers trembled slightly as they reached for the door. The faintest hope stirred within her. It couldn't be real. But the door was there. The world was out there. The question that had haunted her for so long screamed at her from the depths of her soul. What if? She touched the handle. And for the first time in so long, she felt the weight of the world, outside of him, waiting. It was a breath she didn't know she needed to take. A choice she never thought she would make. The door opened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, She stepped into the light. But always, she stood at the threshold of the door, her hand still resting on the cool metal of the handle. The room behind her, the dark, oppressive space that had become her prison, her sanctuary, felt distant now. She could hear the faint sound of her own breath, ragged and uncertain, as if the very act of stepping forward had unsettled her. For so long, there had been no room for doubt, no space for question. But now, as she stood between the life she had known and the life she thought she wanted, a tremor of hesitation ran through her. What if? The question hovered in the silence, like a ghost of a life she had left behind. For so long, she had convinced herself that there was no escaping him, that there was no turning back. She had let him in, welcomed him. And in doing so, she had surrendered her freedom. She had embraced the darkness. But now she wondered what was waiting for her outside. What was on the other side of the door? She turned her head slowly, just enough to catch a glimpse of him behind her. His presence was overwhelming, like a shadow that had become part of her own. He didn't speak, didn't move. He didn't need to. He was still in her, woven into the fabric of her thoughts, her every breath. He was the part of her that had never been left behind, the part she had tried to forget. But now, as her fingers tightened on the door handle, she felt a surge of clarity. For the first time, she understood. She didn't have to choose him. She didn't have to stay. The choice had always been hers. It was always hers. Her hand slowly, deliberately, released the door. She stepped back. The room behind her was no longer her cage. It was just a room. A place that had once held her, but no longer did. She turned and walked away from the door, her footsteps steady, her heart heavy with something new.
Hope.
It wasn't loud or bold. It didn't demand attention. But it was there. And for the first time in forever, she allowed herself to feel it. She stepped out into the unknown, the light of the world outside welcoming her, and she closed the door behind her. It was the final act, the last step, and for the first time she was free. Not from him, but from the fear. And that, she realized, was enough. It was as if she was being pulled into the very essence of who he was. And the strangest thing was, it didn't feel like a force against her will anymore. It felt natural. As if she had always belonged here, with him. In this space, in this darkness. "You're mine now," he whispered, his voice smooth like a lullaby, a dark promise. The word should have sent chills down her spine, but instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over her. It was as if every ounce of resistance, every cry for escape, had melted away into nothingness. "I'm yours," she said, her voice low, almost empty, but oddly peaceful. The words fell from her lips with ease. She had no fear of them, no hesitation. Her own identity, her own desires, had dissolved into the shadows of the room. Her hand, of its own accord, reached out, brushing against his chest, feeling the coldness of his skin, the emptiness inside of him that mirrored the emptiness inside her. There was no need to fight anymore. No need to wonder what had happened to the woman she once was. She had let him in, and now she was a part of him. They were bound, intertwined, two halves of the same whole. The walls around them, once so constricting, now felt like the only safe place in the world. There was no escape. There was no need for one. Her mind, her body, her soul had become a part of him, just as his had become a part of her. She had let him in, and now they were inseparable. The door was no longer an option. The world beyond the window, the life she had once known, was nothing more than a distant memory, fading into the void. It was all gone now. All of it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the need to fight. She didn't feel the need to run. The darkness that had once terrified her now embraced her like an old friend. She didn't want to escape. Not anymore.
Not now.
Not ever. Because, in the end, she had found the one place where she truly belonged. And it was with him. Forever her eyes fluttered closed, and the world around her seemed to fade completely, like a dream she no longer had the strength to wake from. There was only him. Only the cold, suffocating presence of him that now wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into the shadows. She had lost herself, lost everything she was, and yet, in this lost state, there was something strangely comforting. Her pulse slowed. Her breath evened out. She no longer fought.
She didn't want to.
The room was silent except for the soft rhythm of their breathing. It was as though time itself had stopped, and the world outside had ceased to exist. She could feel his presence, his essence in every fiber of her being. It wasn't just him standing next to her, it was him within her. His darkness, his emptiness, now bled into her soul. And yet, for some reason, that dark, infinite space didn't terrify her anymore. It was home. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. She didn't need to answer. She felt it. It was the emptiness that filled her. The void that had once scared her, that had haunted her every waking moment, was now a strange kind of peace. She wasn't sure if it was his voice, his presence, or the deep connection between them that had done it. But the line between who she was and who he was had blurred beyond recognition. There was no Herb anymore. No him anymore.
Just them.
A single entity, bound together in the dark, where time had no meaning and space was irrelevant. Her fingers, trembling ever so slightly, brushed against his chest again. But this time, she didn't recoil. She didn't pull away. She let them rest there. She felt him inside her, his heartbeat synchronized with hers. She could taste his breath, hear his thoughts, and feel his pulse as if it were her own. The thin veil between them had vanished. There was no more separation, no more loneliness, no more fear. "You never had a choice," he said, his words barely more than a whisper in the stillness. She nodded slowly. It wasn't a realization. It wasn't a question. It was simply the truth. Because deep down, she knew it. She had never had a choice. The door, the window, the space she thought she could escape to, none of it had ever been real. It had all been an illusion, a dream, a fleeting fantasy. She had invited him in, and in doing so, she had sealed her fate. Her gaze lifted to his, but there was no fear there, no desperation, just acceptance. He smiled, a faint, knowing curve of his lips. "Now we are whole," he murmured. And in that moment, as their souls intertwined and their fates became one, she felt it. The finality, the certainty. She wasn't just lost anymore. She was found. And the world outside no longer mattered. Because they were together. Forever. Not now. Not ever. The darkness wrapped around them tighter, almost protective, as if the very air had chosen them, bound them in a cocoon of stillness. Outside, the world carried on, distant, irrelevant, unreachable. But inside, there was only the silence of their union. A silence that was more than just quiet. It was the absence of everything. Of all the noise, all the clutter, all the distractions that had once filled her life.
Gone.
Nothing remained except this connection. His fingers brushed her cheek gently, but it wasn't a gesture of affection anymore. It was something deeper, more intimate. A mark, a brand, a promise. She didn't need to speak.
She didn't need to ask.
She felt it all without words. Her body had already become an extension of his. Her thoughts, her desires, her very breath moved in sync with his. And that feeling, that understanding, felt like the only truth that mattered. She had once imagined escape. She had once believed there was a way out. But now, there was no escape from this, from him.